My daughter Kiara loves show and tell. Does anybody here know what this is? So, I'm going to enunciate as clearly as possible. This is called a blood chit. C-H-I-T. I think I actually have it spelled. So it's also referred to as a rescue patch sometimes, or a ransom note. So I might call it that from here on out. The U.S. military officially started using them in the China Theater of Operations in World War II. Versions of this had been used by other servicemen and other militaries in other parts of the world before that. The name actually comes from a British, old British term for a note would have been chit, C-H-I-T. So these were issued to airmen who were designated a high risk of isolation. So if you were maybe a pilot who was flying a mission behind enemy lines and there was a chance you might get shot down, you would be issued this. And you can't really see it from out there, but there are 5 different languages. This one has Chinese right in the middle, along with a couple different ones. And essentially, the message on here says something along the following. I'm not from here. I don't speak your language, but I am on your side, here to help you fight against, it would have been Japan at that point. Please provide me medical aid, food, shelter, anything that I might need, and get me back to a friendly territory, friendly base. And if you do that, you will be rewarded by the U.S. government. So this is essentially an IOU from the U.S. government that if you return our people to us, we will pay you. Now, sometimes these were actually sewed right into the flight jacket of the crew. You can see how the name Blood Note, would come to be, because if they needed to be used, which there were some that did, they very likely would have had blood on them when they got returned. Thankfully, this one actually never needed to be redeemed for cash. It returned with my great-grandfather, who served in the Marine Corps during World War II. Recently, I came across that, and I'd never seen one before, and did a little research. And what kind of struck me about this concept was this idea that a person wearing a rescue patch almost certainly did not read or write or speak the language that was written on the patch. So other than being told what it said, the person wearing it didn't necessarily know, could comprehend it. And so this, even with that in mind, this patch or this note had the potential to save somebody's life. So this patch could save somebody's life even if they didn't understand it, could pay a ransom to bring them home. And the other thing that it served to do was it identified that person with their country, with their culture, right? There's a big flag on the top. And I couldn't help but think that for us, sometimes, the Old Testament, the old Mosaic covenant, can be a little bit like this for us. Meaning, we don't always fully understand what's going on in the Old Testament. Especially the sections that are lots of rules and laws stacked on top of each other. But yet, as people who believe that the Bible is God's word, we know that there is a way that we are marked by it, like we identify with it, even if we don't completely understand it, right? If we're going to be honest, there's all of us probably have parts in the Old Testament, particularly in some of the laws that we're just not exactly sure how that all works. But we know it's significant to us, right? Kind of like this patch. So I do think that there is a lot that we can learn from the law that God gave Moses. And I really have been praying all week that even in a part of the Bible that is maybe more foreign to us than other parts, that there still would be things that God would show us from his word. So I'm going to pray to that end one more time, and then we'll move on a little further. Heavenly Father, thank you again. We're grateful for the time that you've given us today. We're grateful for your word in the Bible that we can look at, we can study. God, we ask that you would be revealing things to us, that you would be illuminating things to us out of this text this morning, that you'd give us just open hearts and open ears and just the desire to learn more about who you are through your word. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So we're covering about 3 chapters this morning in Exodus, chapters 21 through 24. It's actually a little bit more than that, but I want to start just at the tail end of chapter 20. You can turn there now if you want to. Now, don't anybody leave. We're not actually going to read 3.5 chapters, like start to finish this morning. The main content of chapters 21, 2, and 3 are the rules that God gave Moses following the 10 Commandments. So sometimes that's called the Book of the Covenant. God had delivered his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and brought them to Mount Sinai. In chapter 19, we saw how Moses prepared the people for a visit from God. He was preparing the people to enter into a special covenant treaty with God. And last week, Tim took us through that first part of God's 10 big commandments that he gave, literally the 10 words or utterances of God. But after God speaks the 10 commandments to the people, they are overcome with fear, right? They're terrified. And so they ask Moses to go and speak with God and get the rest of the instructions, and then just bring the instructions back and tell them what God said. So as the people kind of withdrew afraid, Moses goes forward. And as Moses approached the cloud, this is what God spoke to him. Exodus 20, verse 22. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it." The first point on your outline, if you're taking notes, is to worship rightly. And I think it's worth mentioning, it's worth pointing out that as right here at the beginning, these are instructions for worship. The altars where the sacrifices and the offerings would be made, the things that people were giving to the Lord. So this is where we are starting, and then if you look at where we'll be ending up in chapter 24, there's also worship happening there as well. So I don't want us to miss the fact that even as we talk about instructions and laws and commands and rules, it's kind of sandwiched in the middle of times of worship. And I think we can kind of pull a little bit from that even just right now, that, worship has to be a priority in our lives. Correct worship. God's first commandment is, have no other gods before me. Jesus can sum up the entire law as this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So what can we learn about worshiping God from this passage? Referring to just this one passage, one Bible scholar says, true biblical worship is characterized by simplicity and purity. Simplicity and purity. I really like that. And something I've said before, and I think I'll say again because I find it to be true, is that the more time I am able to spend with the Lord as I grow, the more that I realize that some of the most important things in our life, particularly even our faith journey, are simple things. Like, they're not complicated things. But we should never mistake something simple for something easy. Like, just because it's a simple instruction, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, does not mean it's easy to do. And I think we see this a little bit in the instructions of the altars too. The altar of earth, and no hewn stones, no stones that were cut or shaped by human hands. So both of these values, the simplicity and the purity, were intended to contrast God's people with other pagan religions of the day. The worship sites of other religions would almost certainly have had great, big, giant altars in silver and gold and any ornate thing they could find. God wanted his altars to be simple, probably for quite a few reasons, but here are a couple. First, nature is the work of God's hands. And because of that, there is a sacredness to it. Of course, we do not worship nature. We believe God has called us to be stewards, good stewards of nature, which does mean utilizing natural resources. But I think we also should be free to enjoy the beauty of creation as a good reflection of a good creator. And second, an altar made of earth, which earth could also kind of mean clay made into bricks, but an altar made of earth and uncut stones could really not end up structurally being that grand and big. You know, if you can cut stone and you can make joints and flat surfaces, I mean, you could build a castle if you wanted to. But if you build something huge and lavish and grand, there's always a danger that the worship becomes more about that thing or the people who made it than it does about the God it was intended to honor. And so in a similar way, God also wanted the worship of his people to be pure. So a grand, tall altar at the top of a stepped pyramid, I don't know if you guys can picture that. Sometimes they call them like a ziggurat, it's like a pyramid with steps, would have been pretty common in the world at that time for other religions. And so it's almost like God is giving his people instructions to do the exact opposite of what they see everybody else doing in their worship. And it's for good reason, because I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because there's young minds in the room, but there was a certain unsavory element to a lot of the pagan cultural religious practices of the day. Namely, temple prostitution was a big thing back then. There was all kinds of debauchery, clothing optional things that would happen at a worship service at some of these places. So God, it might seem funny to us, for God to say, don't make steps up to the altar and a kind of prohibition on nakedness, but it was very, very relevant for the day. So the commands for Israelite worship were meant to keep the focus on God himself. The simplicity and the purity of worshiping should keep us from distractions, should keep us safe from the things that will try to steal our attention away from him. Now, today we do not offer sacrifices on altars, so the earth and stone stuff might not apply that much to us, right? Because we certainly don't ever suffer from distraction, do we? Honestly, sometimes I feel like my entire life is distractions, right? A lot of it is self-imposed. We do it to ourselves. And while I think simplicity is something that we like as an ideal, like we like to talk about simplicity as something great, we are terrible at it in practice. And while that definitely creeps into our worship, it creeps into every part of our lives, it is particularly affects relationships. And so while this text and this sermon is not going to be about distractions, I think there is one coming sometime in the near future. I don't know about you guys, but it seems like more and more conversations I have with people, just distraction and busyness and attention, competition, it's like we're all on this merry-go-round that keeps getting pushed faster and faster and faster, and at some point we're going to start losing people. For today, for this passage, I think it's important for us to realize that God sees your heart when in worship. So God does delight in worship that is simple and is pure. Meaning, give him your full attention when we're singing. When we're singing to God, give him your full attention. Pray as passionately when you are thankful for things as when you are praying because you need things. Give your time and your treasure to him faithfully, regularly, however small it might seem to you. And so on that point, before we move on, I want to talk about the two offerings mentioned in this section. Verse 24 talks about the burnt offering and the peace offering. Now we know from later instructions kind of what that might have been. The burnt or the whole offering was an animal that was burned completely on the altar. And the purpose of that was to atone or cover the sin of the people. The peace offering or the fellowship offering was a little different. Only the fat of that animal was burned, which kind of represented the choicest or the best part of the animal. The rest of the meat was not burned up on the altar, it was actually just cooked, prepared into a meal. And the express purpose of that was for the worshipers, the people, to share a meal in the presence of God in peace and fellowship. So, see the connection there. The whole burnt offering is consumed to cover for the sin of the people so that the people can celebrate the peace offering in the presence and fellowship and communion with God. It's an important concept. We'll circle back to it later. The next point, number 2, is live justly. And so this will kind of cover that most of the 3 chapters in the middle of the section. Exodus 21:1 says, "Now these are the rules that you shall set before them." So that word rules also could be rulings or judgments. The idea is that these rules will shape the identity of God's people by applying the 10 Commandments to their everyday situations. So, again, kind of the purpose of this is that the identity of God's people will be shaped by applying the 10 Commandments to what everyday life is going to look like for them. Now, that said, keep in mind that everyday life for somebody who lived 3,000 years ago is going to look a little different than everyday life for us today. The things that are going to be touched on in this section are going to be things like slavery, arson, boiling goats, what to do if your ox gores somebody, and it's different if they die or not. A lot of things that we might not identify very easily with. Come to think of it, this is kind of a lot to try to do, and I'm not sure why I didn't ask Joe to take the teaching this week. In addition to keeping in mind that these books of the Bible were written to a specific historical time and place, it is also helpful to see that the Mosaic Law in relation to some of its uses or primary applications. So generally what that means is sometimes we talk about the law in terms of its moral, civil, and ceremonial categories. Now, that's not a totally neat and tidy way to divide up the law, but I have found it to be very helpful. Now, the reason I say it's not perfect is because some commands might actually fall into multiple categories. So one example of that might be the Sabbath. Keeping the Sabbath has elements of all 3. It is the 4th commandment, so it is certainly part of God's moral foundational code, but it was also part of the civic laws because how they interacted as a community was governed by this, and it was also had a ceremonial or religious importance because of its special place in the holy days and festivals. But even though it's not an exact science, doesn't mean that it can't still be helpful. So if you look at the kind of the totality of the instructions that God gives us in the Old Testament, that he gives to the Israelites in the first 5 books of the Bible, we do see that the 10 Commandments really are a foundational moral law that God gives. All of them are confirmed in some way, either explicitly or at least in principle, in the New Testament. And God also gave detailed instructions to his people for their ceremonies and their religious worship, how to construct the tabernacle, how to offer sacrifices, what made a person ceremonially clean or unclean. Now, one of the things that these laws specifically accomplished in their time and place in history was they made God's people special and distinct and unique from all the other peoples of the world. Now, we also find a great deal of these civil laws or regulations that God gave his people to govern their nation. And a lot of that is what's here in chapters 21, 22, and 23. Now, that word rules, like I said a couple minutes ago in 21:1, could also be translated rulings, judgments, or like just decrees. So the idea is that these would almost be like case laws, case studies, where the judges, if you recall, Moses put people over tens and hundreds and fifties and thousands. These people who were making judgments between the people could refer to these regulations to help them decide between the people. Now, these parts of the Bible are commonly taken out of context and weaponized against Christians. Now, because of that, rather than, again, just read through 3.5 chapters, which, everybody loves a nap, but probably not right here. Rather than read through all that, I thought what I would do is just pick out one of the more difficult ones, one of the ones that probably is more offensive to us today than most of the other ones, possibly the most offensive, and just kind of break it down a little bit and see what might have been going on that we don't always comprehend from our particular historical perspective. So the laws are kind of broken down into categories. There's categories on how to deal with slaves, compensation for injuries, restitution, justice, holy days and festivals. And the one that I want to look at is 21 verses 2 through 4. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. Slavery, kind of hot topic. The Bible is constantly accused of condoning slavery. Part of that is because in our nation's own dark history, dark parts of our history, some people wrongly used Scripture to try to reinforce and justify that practice. So, before we even start getting down any further than that, we need to say that slavery has looked very different across different history, eras of history and different cultures. The slave trade that happened here in North America is sometimes called chattel slavery. And in that system, a slave was seen as nothing more than property. The word chattel simply means possession or property. They had no rights, they had no term limit on how long they would serve. In this system, the slave never had personhood. They were never seen as human even. It was truly an evil thing. But again, keep in mind that we also cannot take our 2019 perspective and try to impose that on the late Bronze Age culture. And besides, we can kind of stop that just at verse 16, where God says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death." So it's pretty obvious and clear that type of slavery, of dehumanizing chattel slavery, is explicitly forbidden by God. So in reality, that's not the type of slavery that we're talking about here, and it's not the type of slavery that's been practiced in most cultures throughout history. Many times becoming a slave was actually voluntary. Somebody would voluntarily take the action of selling themselves into slavery for a period of time in order to better their life or situation. Sometimes they'd have to do it to pay a debt. And what they could do is they could agree to, be a slave for a period of time. But at the end of their time, they could leave, many times with money or with property, depending on the place, even an education. If they loved their job and they liked where they lived, they could choose to stay. And that happened. Otherwise, it was almost always just a temporary arrangement. So back to the question, though. Verse 4 says, "If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone." Now, that was a little uncomfortable for me the first time I read it. I mean, if a slave starts a family while he's a slave, he can't take his wife and kids with him when he leaves. It just doesn't seem right. So, kind of notwithstanding the fact that there are a lot of things that we don't know, and we just have to be comfortable with that, right? We are not all-knowing. We don't know everything about every situation in history, but I would just say consider this. It was a very different, much more dangerous world back then. And most of us have lived our entire lives in peacetime. And not only in peacetime, most of us have not lived through war zones, but we also live in the most technologically advanced, most wealthy nation in the history of the world. We have social safety nets, in addition to charities who will supply needs of people before they die in the streets. In many places in the ancient world, however, you could just as easily die from starvation as you could from a spear of a neighboring tribe. Just growing and gathering enough food was most people's full-time job. Survival was a day-to-day struggle. Now, imagine a scenario where a guy with no prospects gets into a tough spot and decides to go into slavery, essentially indentured servitude is really a probably more accurate term for it. But he's going to work 6 years to kind of meet his basic needs, possibly have a debt he needs to get out of. And during his time there, he meets somebody, gets married. With the owner's blessing, they start a family. He was single when he started, so when his term is up, he is free to go, but free alone. Now, legally, he would have had the right to purchase or redeem his family from his old master. However, I think we should also consider the fact that even in this situation, this is somebody who maybe was not capable of providing for himself before, which is how he ended up being a slave. One common situation in the day was even if somebody was caught stealing and they couldn't repay the debt of the thing they stole, they would be sold into slavery to repay the debt. So, with all that in mind, and considering how the world was back then, and because nothing would have been preventing him from purchasing, redeeming his family, I think there's at least a perspective, a way that we could see it, where until the time that he was able to provide and take care of his family, his wife and kids were probably safer where they were. Now, I don't say that to try to defend the practice of slavery, even ancient slavery, but what I'm saying is just this. Although something like that might seem really offensive to our sensibilities now, I can see how a law like this could have served a purpose of restraining evil in the day. In that specific environment and culture, as imperfect as it was, these laws could have provided protection for people who otherwise might have been really vulnerable or disadvantaged, who might not have had protection otherwise. Does that make sense? So, as we seek to follow God's moral law today, we will hopefully arrive at different applications than that, right? But that doesn't in any way take away, it doesn't make the ancient applications somehow bad or less valid. So you could see how some of these same laws, we could go through a lot of these same laws and do the same thing, right? A little bit of better historical perspective, trying to think outside of our moment in history, we could understand them a little better. I think Pastor Mark is actually doing a similar thing, but with the rules on selling your daughter into slavery. So I think that's probably why Natalie's out here worshiping with us this morning and not downtown. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of practical application here in chapters 21 through 23, and it can kind of just be summed up by the words of the prophet Micah. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So friends, we are commanded to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we love God, we will love other people and treat them justly. Right? Let's turn to Exodus 24. Starting in verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, the 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." Point number 3 is to commit fully. Now, this is such a significant moment in the Exodus story. The people are officially, legally entering into their covenant relationship with God. So this is the God who heard their cries when they were slaves in Egypt, and he brought them out. He brought them here to Sinai. He gave his law to Moses in the 10 Commandments, the fire on the mountain, the earthquakes, the smoke, the thunder, the lightning. The law has been read to them twice, sealed with the blood of the offering. The people are all in. They say, "We will obey." And so this is part of their worship, as part of their confirmation, the ratification of that covenant. Their commitment to God. They make these 2 offerings, the burnt offering and the peace offering. Remember, the burnt offering covers their sin, and the peace offering represented their fellowship and communion with God that is possible when their sin is dealt with. And so Moses took the blood from that offering, and my translation says he threw it on the people. I don't know if it was quite like that. It was probably more of like a sprinkling. But after being sprinkled by the blood, the elders, which represented the whole group of people, right? The elders were representative of the people as a whole, and they go up to share a meal, have a meal in the very presence of God, God's literal presence. Now, that should be a whole sermon probably. Like that part should be a whole sermon. But the main thing that I want us to look at in relation to what we're talking about this morning is how this covenant has shaped their identity, has made them who they were. So just remember that this is a nation of runaway slaves. It's been less than 3 months since they left Egypt. Can you imagine that many people trying to figure out how to live together? What kind of nation they were going to be? They don't even have their own land with borders yet. And so here at Mount Sinai, God's covenant, his law that he gives to them is a gift, right? The law of God given through Moses to help give order and shape the nation and how to deal with each other. They needed that. That was a gift to them, but it's a gift to us too. I mean, we don't live in ancient Israel, so the civil parts of that, how they provided kind of governance for the people, that doesn't provide for us in the same way. And the ceremonial parts of the law, Jesus perfectly fulfilled those once for all, ending the need to sacrifice animals. But we still are people shaped by that. We are shaped by God's moral law, certainly. We should not commit idolatry. We should not make idols. We should rest. We should honor our parents. We should not take things that don't belong to us. We should respect and honor and cherish life. And I mean, the best part is we know it doesn't have to be complicated. You know, we don't necessarily need 6,000 rules. Jesus made it pretty simple. Not easy, but simple. When he said, "Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." We can keep the 10 Commandments that way, at least as best we can. And by God's grace, I pray that this is the type of people that we will become. I mean, I do think that there is an element of God shaping our own identity in this. You know, even here at the Murphy campus, I already see God at work in a lot of your lives. And I don't know about you, but I think 5 years from now, I'm really excited about looking back on this year and seeing where God has brought us. Not because we are doing anything great, actually kind of the opposite. It's because God is really good at taking simple, ordinary, common things like us and making something special out of it, you know? Including us. God can do that. So this rescue patch, the only reason that it had power to potentially save somebody's life was because it represented something, right? A cloth patch, functionally, cannot do anything, right? There's nothing significant in the material itself. But what it represents had the power to save a life and saved many lives. The old covenant had power because it represented the future. It represented the perfect work of Jesus Christ that he was going to do. In Exodus 24, the burnt offering they showed us, it atoned for the sin of the people. Moses sprinkled them with the blood. I'm going to invite the band to come back up here. And we see in the new covenant, Jesus was that ultimate, perfect, once-for-all burnt offering. So when we believe in him, there's a way in which we are covered by his blood, right? We are sprinkled with his blood, which saves us from sin, which covers us from sin. And God desires a relationship with his people. He did in Exodus, and he still does today. The peace offering was a meal shared in the very presence of God. And it showed the fellowship and the communion that God desired to have with his people. So as the Old Testament was ratified, Moses and the elders shared that meal together. Jesus taught us that the new covenant is made in Jesus' own blood, rather than the blood of goats or bulls, any animals. And Jesus gave his followers instructions that we still follow to this day, that we are to remember that. And that remembrance is also a meal, right? We call it communion, and we take it together. And we do that as a church to remind us of the covenant that God has made with us through Jesus. And so in just a minute, we're going to pass around the elements of that bread and the cup. And we'll have a song of worship. And then after that song, let's all take it together. I'll come back up here. But I really want us to reflect on this idea. Many of us ignore parts of the Old Testament because they're difficult to understand, but really can add a whole new dimension and depth to the things that we do believe and have been taught about Jesus.